even stuff like boulevard trees to change people's mental state, or putting some landscaping into vacant lots had measurable impact on mental health. But the
Hello and welcome to Untitled Planning. Today we're diving deep into the world of urban design and psychology with our guest, Dr. Colin Ellard. Dr. Ellard is a distinguished researcher at the University of Waterloo, located in Ontario, Canada. Dr. Ellard explores our city's influence on our minds and emotions. His work sheds light on the profound ways urban spaces shape our daily lives. So welcome, Dr. Ellard.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So cities have one of the most significant impacts on our lives. At Untitled Planning, we dive deep into these impacts to spark discussion and action to enhance the spaces that we live in. Now, today we have Rachel joining us as a co-host. So Rachel, if you want to introduce yourself quickly.
Yeah, thanks so much for letting me tag along with you guys on this conversation. For those of you who are unfamiliar with me and my work, I'm a cultural placemaker based in the EU, looking to bridge the communication gap between developers, planners, and community leaders, to hopefully empower people who are inside of the built space, get knowledge on how they can then speak about it for themselves in the future. So thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to get this conversation going.
So thank you, Colin, once again. So the first question we have for you is, can you please provide a brief introduction of yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. I'm by training, I'm a neuroscientist. These days we call ourselves cognitive neuroscientists, and more specifically, I'm especially interested in the influence of the settings of our lives at every scale, from the insides of rooms to at urban scale, on what we do and how we feel. And I study that both in the field and in simulations in VR.
That's awesome. And there's also a word that comes to mind when we were doing some research on you and your work, and that's psychogeography. And I was wondering if you could break down what that means per se, and how that also affects the human experience in our cities and spaces.
Sure. It's an interesting word with an interesting story that I won't belabor too much, other than to say that word was definitely not my invention. There was a political and philosophical movement that arose in France in the 20th century, with the main premise being that one could use the design of space to have an effect on human activity, including in ways that could be somewhat nefarious. So as I said, it was the motivations of the group of original psychogeographers was quite political, and they had opinions about the degree to which even the way that you design streets can, for example, either afford or prevent gathering, would be one simple example. And so they had a methodology that they called the derive. And in the derive, there are various different ways of doing it, but the idea basically was to take a walk through the streets and allow yourself to drift in accord with just whatever you saw, whatever struck your fancy, would be the scientific way of putting it, I suppose. And there are also other ways to do these derives where you might adopt a simple rule. So, for example, let's say I'll make 2 left turns and then a right turn, and I'll just keep repeating that pattern and see what happens. So that was the origin of psychogeography, and I guess I sort of co-opted that term in the subtitle to my book, where the idea again was to try to understand the psychology of place. And so it just seemed like an apt word, the risk being connecting myself with this old political movement. But honestly, I mean, there's a lot of merit to thinking about the way that space is designed in that way. There's all kinds of settings where there is a very deliberate intention to manipulate you, to encourage you, to nudge you, but stronger than a nudge, to do certain kinds of things. especially things like retail environments or, you know, the worst case casinos. That's what the design of space is all about in those settings. I can't remember what your question was now. I just went on.
No, that's pretty much, I mean, it kind of was then how does psychogeography impact our spaces? But you mentioning and touching on our retail spaces, I would even say the way that we develop wayfinding for museums, right? Or supermarkets, those are all elements that designers and planners and like all of the above think about, right? To develop spaces for people to use, and maybe they're just unaware of the fact that their movement actually is influenced by the way that certain structures are set up. So that was really great. Yeah, thanks for giving us that primer.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, we're talking about the psychology of like retail. I started thinking about like IKEA. And I know there's a whole theory about how they get you to stay there forever and ever and ever, and you come out and it's like dark. It's like what's it called, the land of the lotus eaters and like the Odyssey, that kind of vibe.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, exactly. There's a fascinating. There's a talk and there's also a transcribed article in print by somebody named Alan Penn in the UK, and he talks about what does he call it? Dark patterns in relationship to IKEA. I mean, that's one of the really fascinating things I find a little scary about retail environments is that the people who design these spaces, and I don't want to cast all of these people as being evil. I mean, we need retail environments, but there's this kind of story that emerged that there's something called the Gruen transfer. It's named after Victor Gruen, who was the inventor of the shopping mall. And the idea is that we know that when people experience a complete loss of control, there's that moment of surrender. And in that moment of surrender, we'll do anything, including buying anything. So the dark rationale of something like an IKEA space or lots of other spaces in shopping malls, for example, is to get you to that point where you don't really know where you are anymore. And then you're more likely to empty your pockets.
That is nuts.
Yeah.
Isn't that dark? Geez, let's talk about something other than retail, please.
We definitely will be.
Well, I was going to say actually the next question.
But I'm fascinated by that. Yeah.
No, I was going to say the next question is actually about your book, which you know talks in the title at least is like why we can find our way to the moon but get lost at the mall. And I think you kind of touched on some of the elements of that. But we were curious to learn more about like the insights. First of all, the name is great. So second of all, like the insights that originated this concept in this book and what we can learn from it. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I think it all kind of started when I was I was trying to develop ideas, not necessarily even thinking about a book. And going for lots of walks, and I kept getting lost. In fact, some of the reviews of the book, some of the nastier ones suggested that, you know, here's a psychologist just trying to justify his own ineptitude by writing a book about it. I think there was maybe a bit more to it than that. But what really interested me was that coming from a background of studying spatial behavior in animals, I knew about lots of really great examples of animals that were capable of these incredible feats of navigation. My very favorite of all time, this is not an animal that I studied, but that I learned things about, an animal called the African desert ant. So the African desert ant, it's a scavenger, so it wanders across the surface of the desert, hence the name, and for long distances, and then eventually, hopefully, finds some food, carcass of something, and drags it back to its nest. And if you scale up to human terms, what it's doing basically is wandering for about the distance of a human marathon, about 40 kilometers, and then it makes a straight run back to its nest from wherever it is. and so there are actually experiments, not on the same scale at all, but with human beings over very small scales, like distances of maybe 10 meters, showing that we are abject failures at that kind of thing. So I became really interested in the differences between the animals that I studied and the animals that other people studied, and what human beings were doing. And And so that's where that subtitle came from. The idea that, of course, when it comes to understanding the theoretical basis of space and doing the physics and the calculations, we can do all kinds of amazing stuff, including getting ourselves to the moon. But in our everyday life, there are all kinds of examples of even people who are quite experienced in wayfinding getting terribly lost. So the motivation of the book was to try to figure out what was going on with that. And that kind of led me to, so that book, the first half of it is about animal navigation. And then the second half of it was about the things that I'm interested in now, which I'll be completely honest, I didn't know very much about when I wrote the book. And it's not exactly what you should do, but I felt as though I learned a lot. I taught myself by writing the book. I'm not sure if that was a great idea or not, but anyway.
Well, they do say that while you're writing through the process of creative writing or writing about stuff, that you should be doing it while you're learning and almost not know what the end is in store. And that's some of the best writing that can kind of come from that mindset. So
yeah, well, that was certainly true of this book. When I embarked on the thing, I knew a lot about animal navigation, and I knew nothing about the other side of it. And I remember when you send off your manuscript to your editor, and then you wait for endless weeks to get feedback, and then he called me and he said, there's one part of the book that I want you to eliminate, and I just want to make sure that before you read my notes, you pour yourself a nice drink and you sit in a comfortable chair and you just relax and don't respond to me today. And I thought, oh my God, he's going to want me to cut all the stuff that I thought was really cool that I just learned about.
Right.
And it wasn't that. It was another part of the book. Oddly enough, it was there was a third part of the book in the original draft. It was about neuroscience. And so then I just thought, yay, I can learn by writing, and people will let me do this. So it was a lot of fun.
That's super cool.
That's fascinating. So as a follow-up, you have another book in one of your more recent books is The Places of the Heart, the Psychogeography of Everyday Life. Explores many topics, one of them being how the surroundings influence us, how our surroundings influence us. And so maybe if you could elaborate on that book, how it came to be, and its kind of overall essence.
Sure. I think the very early origins of the book, the first discussions were in the aftermath of my first book, and my idea was really very different at the time, because the thing that happens when you publish a book is that immediately people want to know what you're thinking about doing next, just in case you happen to be wildly successful. They want to be ready to pounce. And so the idea that I pitched was that I wanted to go to write kind of a literary nonfiction travel book where I just went to some really fascinating parts of the world, walked around, observed, wrote, and embedded the science into the stories. And my publishers at the time, not my publisher anymore, very wisely said, "We know what's going on here. You just want a big advance so you can go traveling." And yeah, that's really part of what I want. Yeah. So it kind of went from that to a maybe a slightly saner idea to just think about the palette of emotions, and to think about how you could apply a particular emotion or set of emotions to places. So I have a chapter on places of anxiety, a chapter on places of lust, which isn't really about lust, but I thought that was kind of grabby to encourage people to think about the places that we develop affection for, and sometimes a little bit beyond affection. So I mean, that basically the idea was to cover a lot of territory and to divide the world up according to the kinds of things that we normally think of as our basic palette of emotions.
Mhm.
That's really cool. And now I think as our world becomes more digital, and myself, I work in social media, I'm very much online all day. And the conversations around being online all day, how that's starting to reduce our social capital, now create social breakdown, even that these are issues that as urbanists and architects, we're trying to combat in ways to entice people back in to our physical space. And so I'm curious what your opinion is, or how you think that these effects of technology what the effects of this technology is going to have on our relationship with us humans being in space, and its integration, the integration of technology in space. What will be the ultimate impact? I
Oh
can
man,
repeat myself if I
yeah. No, that is such a great question, and it's such a huge question, and it's I'd have to say it's a current obsession. I will also
yeah.
confess that I don't have any ready, easy answers to this, but it's a tough one. You're right. I mean, we have lost um, social capital. We are continuing to lose social
Yeah.
capital. You see it in so many different ways. I mean, one of the things that I've been involved in a little bit is the um, the the debate about working from home,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that was clearly triggered by the pandemic, but it was stuff that was happening before the pandemic. A lot of this stuff, with our current perspective, we say, oh, everything kind of unraveled when we were locked down, but things were unraveling in that sense long before that.
Completely.
And I think part of what seems to have happened is that we have lost our sense of the preciousness of real space. So
Hmm.
if there's an expediency to using an electronically mediated kind of environment, then there's strong temptations to do that. And it's completely understandable. If I'm a harried commuter and I'm living in the suburbs of a city like Toronto and I have to get into the core, it's awful. I was
Mm-hmm.
talking to somebody about this yesterday, and I have to look up this. This is a little bit of a tangent, but this finding that showed that the stress levels of an urban commuter are about on par with the stress levels of a fighter pilot. And so,
Oh,
if you can avoid that, then of course you're going to. And
yeah.
the understanding what's lost by doing that is a little bit more subtle. But I think that we're beginning to see certain things winding down. What else do I want to say about this huge question? I mean, there's some really strange stuff that I think some people have measured that happens to us when we live too much of our lives on Zoom meetings or whatever. There's a paper that intrigued me about the emergence of something called depersonalization disorder that is
Mm.
measurably increased in people who spend the longest amount of time in screen mediated environments rather than in real life.
Hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. So what do you
Wow.
do about all of that? I mean, I'm just to blow my horn for a second about this. I think it's next week. I'm giving a talk at South by Southwest with an architecture firm called Populous in Kansas, and
Wow.
our theme is that we need these places of real encounter. And Populous, I think, builds entertainment venues right up to stadium size things. And so, I mean, they have a clear mandate to find ways to bring people together. And so I want to talk about the importance of our finding ways to do that. But how do you, I can't remember the words that you used, but it's got to be some kind of, we've got to work out some kind of hybrid solution. The,
Completely. Yeah. I agree.
the technological stuff is not going to go away.
Yeah.
But understanding its limitations and understanding the losses is really super important. And I feel like, that's one of the reasons why I do what I do, is because I just feel as though in the general everyday way, we don't really appreciate the impact that real spaces have on how we feel, what we do.
Yeah.
A lot of it just happens in the background. You're not particularly aware of it. If you look at, there's a, I won't say too much about this, but there's a small company based in the UK that I'm involved in. It's planners, some visualization specialists, and some other people. And I'm, I guess, the token scientist, and the single point that is hardest to make to that group of people, and I don't think this is uncommon, is that it's not all about what you attend to and what you're conscious of. Most of it, I think, is about stuff that's happening in the background, in your periphery, stuff that makes for atmosphere in a setting.
Sure.
That is not what you're looking at. It's out here somewhere, but it's really important.
I totally agree. If I could actually interject as well, I think because this is something I'm just starting to really have a lot of interest in, and it really fires me up. I think that there's a loss of serendipity as well when you're completely in technology, and our physical spaces actually allow us to experience that even more, which is why having in-person experiences is even more important now more than I think it ever has been, just because of the way that we built in the past has kind of exacerbated the experiences that we're having now, where technology is so easily accessible to us, and it creates less friction for us to connect with one another. But like you mentioned, we're losing these nuances in the ambiance of our experiences, as well as potentially having random sparks of connection with one another in our places. So super interesting.
Yeah, totally agree with that. I'm a great fan of serendipity and friction. I think you used the word friction. I think they're both. They're both. I mean, that could be a segue into talking about things like responsive environments as well. This whole idea that what we want to do is to just make things slippery and easy for people in their settings, I think is maybe a little bit wrong-headed, and we don't even like it. I mean, if you look at where people have tried to design these kinds of responsive environments, and maybe, I always pick on, I forget what Google called it, that project in Toronto that eventually tanked.
Sidewalks, yeah.
Sidewalk, yeah. So, I mean, part of the problem there, and part of the problem in other places where similar things have been designed, is that we just hate it. We just we don't want our environment to. I was close to swearing there. I'm trying to be careful. To cocoon us, right? We don't want to lose all of that, the friction of actually dealing with things and dealing with other people. And yeah, we do serendipity. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I think it is one of the well springs of creativity. And again, that's a big issue with going back to work from home. I had last year, I think it's okay to talk about this. It's public. I had a chance to go to talk to to talk at the Novartis campus in Basel. Novartis, I don't know if you know anything about this place. It's just like, oh my God, they spent, it's a multi-billion-dollar work campus. They recruited, I think, a half dozen Pritzker Prize winning architects to design buildings. And then, going back to the pandemic for a second, they had to shut down or lock down like everyone else. And then after it was over, nobody wanted to come back. And they thought, like, what the heck? Like, we built this paradise of a work setting for people. And even there, people don't want to come back. And it's, it's Basel. It's not like, New York or Toronto. So the commuting problems, that wouldn't account for it. So my task was to, and this was not my entire task, but part of it was to was to give a talk there to inspire their employees to think about why they might benefit from coming back to the workplace. A lot of the design of that campus was meant to encourage those kinds of serendipitous interactions, but under the most pleasant kinds of circumstances. So the fact that it was a straw, and I think it's better now, but and no thanks to me, I'm sure, but the fact that they built something so magnificent and it was still a battle to get people to use it suggests to me that there's maybe some basic misunderstanding of how important this stuff is.
Yeah. I also feel, and to some extent, it's maybe the way that we've been approaching it, and I'm new to this study, and I my grounding on certain things that I'm saying may not be as well founded as some of your thoughts, but I feel that there is a need to focus on culture in our spaces and the historical connection that we have to them, and that those are ways to help incentivize people to come into spaces more, because it will allow people to create memories around this historical lineage of people who have been inhabited these spaces in the past, who inhabit it now, and who will inhabit it in the future. And from my findings from just living in Spain over the last couple of years is the importance of like the festival, the social gatherings, to not only just have normal social interactions on a day-to-day basis, but also to have an intergenerational connection with one another is a huge part to what the people in this culture feel differentiates them from so many other cultures in Northern Europe and other parts of the world as well. But I only want to speak to the very small knowledge that I feel I do know slightly.
Yeah,
So,
I think that's well put, and I think that's really really a key part of all of this. And there are some there are lots of great examples of I guess what you'd call the culture of space. I mean, the way that we tie in the design of a place to I don't think this is a mansplain, but I'm kind of paraphrasing what you just said, that
please.
that our stories are woven into places, and I don't, I suppose you could argue that you can maybe do some of that technologically with simulations or whatever, but I don't buy it. I don't think that you can, because I think that if we try to do that, we're underappreciating the role of the body. I think it's it's really important that the body go to these places, and that bodies meet to make all of that kind of thing happen. And historically, I mean, that's the way this has worked. Somebody was telling me, in fact, it was one of the people that I'm speaking with next week was telling me about, I think it's Siena. There's a public square, I think, in the city, and there's an event. I forget what it's called, but there's one day per year when this event is held, and basically everybody in the city goes to the square, and it's kind of ritualistic, but it's tied to that place. You have to be there. You can't watch it on YouTube. You have to be there to make the experience and for others, and to experience it for yourself. And maybe I'm old fashioned, but I like to think that you can't duplicate that with VR, AR, screens, phones, anything. It's your physical being has to be in the place.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
Yeah, I agree as well. I'm part of the work that I do at the Infrastructure Institute is doing exhibitions, and you spend all this time making these really beautiful kind of like environments and spaces, but you have to then programming is ultimately what gets people to come and view it. Like you can't, and it's funny because I went to a similar another like networking event, and I met this PR marketing woman, and I asked her a similar question where I was like, okay, you design all these, like, for these high caliber clients, you design these events and whatnot. I'm like, so what does it take to really get to make a successful event? And she said it's the programming. It is those, like, we talk about that serendipity, creating those moments for those bodies to actually be in these spaces. So I think there's like transferable, I think, lessons even when we're designing those smaller environments.
Yeah.
But I want to jump because I know we're talking about virtual and digital and kind of the, I guess, the negative parts of that. But there are benefits in the sense that we know you use virtual reality in your research. So how might virtual environments actually help urban planners and architects and other, I guess, city builders visualize and optimize designs for human well-being and creating that serendipity that we need?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's certainly some scope for doing that, and obviously I think that because I use it in my research. I think that one way to think of it, and the way that my thoughts have evolved over the time that I've been using those kinds of methods, is that I went in with this really kind of simplistic, overly optimistic notion that anything that I could model, I could put people into the model in VR, and I would be able to make ironclad predictions about how they would respond to that same thing in real life. And I've had that idealistic notion beaten out of me over years of experimental experience. So I think, and I don't think we understand this completely at all. There are differences between what happens in VR and how we feel and what we do and real life. And some of it is sort of ephemeral, and some of it maybe is less so. But I always say, and this is not really satisfactory as an end explanation, but I always say that simply by virtue of the fact that we know that something isn't real, no matter how realistic, no matter how beautiful the model and detailed the model and fantastic the technology, just knowing that, like that the ontological part just means that we're not going to treat it in the same way as a real space. So for me, the interesting questions are around the scope and limits of using those kinds of visualizations for solving practical problems. And I think there is some scope, but there are also some limits. So what we just, this is not exactly hot off the press. It was published in 2020, but I did some work with a then graduate student. Now he's graduated, moved on, Rabah Mazumdar, and we did some research looking at the psychological impact of high density, high rise development. And so that was one of the few cases that I've seen in anybody's work, and certainly the only time that I've been able to do this, where we were able to compare side by side people's responses to a real setting. We found a nice setting in London where it was really convenient experimentally, because we could have people stand one way and be in front of the Leadenhall building, a substantial high rise, and then just rotate and they'd be standing in front of some nice heritage religious architecture. And so we compared, we measured differences between responses depending on which way people were standing. And then we just imported all of that into our equipment using 360 video and did the same comparison in the laboratory. And in that case, and basically what we found was that everything trended in the same directions, but the effects were bigger in the real world than in VR. So if that's all it is, I mean, that's fine, as long as we accept that, effect sizes will be smaller in VR, but they'll line up with the real world. Then that gives us a lot of scope to be able to use VR to make predictions about what might happen in real life. But there's always, this little caveat in the back of my mind that sometimes this is not going to work, and we might not know right away why that is, and that's a tricky thing. And we're still, even though we've been at this for a while, I think it's fair to say we're still learning how to do this well. I mean, going back to what I was saying before about how often we're preoccupied with planning decisions, I think, can sometimes be preoccupied with paying attention to what's in our awareness, what we're conscious of. So I'll give you an example. The company that I'm involved in England, because in the city of London, there's so much heritage that planning decisions are just horrendous. I mean, debates can go on for years. There can be court battles that cost a fortune. And so our motivation was basically to think, is there a way they use the science to make objective predictions about the impact of a design? So the idea was, you could have a proposal turned down because let's say it's a high rise. If the high rise is built, then as you're walking across a bridge across the Thames, for a moment, that high rise would appear in the same frame as St. Paul's Cathedral, and that would scotch it. So this is turning into a long tangent. You probably want to edit this down to something reasonable, but the idea is, okay, well, we can do eye tracking. So we can have people go through a simulation of the bridge. We can put in the high rise, and we can measure whether there are any eye fixations that land on the high rise. And then, my worry about that kind of approach is that, again, it neglects the fact that it's not like eye tracking is only going to tell you about the thing that we're attending. It's not going to tell you about all of the impact of everything else that's in the scene. So, I mean, that's not exactly a criticism of the technology itself, but I guess it's more criticism of the way that sometimes we try to use the biometrics in the technology. There's a lot of I'm going to beat on these people a little bit without mentioning any names, but there's a lot of not a lot, but there's some research that focuses on trying to understand what we like, what we prefer, what we attend to in the built environment, using eye tracking methods, showing people pictures. And one of the findings is that I'm going to be a bit cheeky about this, but I don't think I'm really far off the mark. That, look, if we show this residential structure, then notice how people are focusing, they're fixating on the doors and the windows. And I think, like, what the hell else? Like, what else are they? They're not going to look at the blank walls. What is that really telling you? And it's not telling you anything about how they feel about it.
Right.
Right.
So anyway, I'll end that rant right there before.
No, that was super interesting. Now, Mike, with you, I guess, realizing that since people realize that the VR isn't reality, and so they're not going to perceive what they're seeing in VR as real life, and so their reaction or subconscious reaction might not be the same as if they were out in the real world, correct?
Yeah.
From what I understood.
Yeah.
So with that being in mind, what are you looking for then with these kind of VR experiments?
Okay, so I think I get it now. So notwithstanding that limitation, how can we still use VR? That's a tricky question to answer, because I still feel as though we don't know enough yet to know where VR is going to fail us. So I think what we need to do, this is kind of a waffly answer, but I think we need to do more of the head-to-head comparisons where we can of real life and VR. I think, in my hands, the kinds of things that work really well in VR are, I'm going to call them reflexive, more or less automatic motor reactions to things. So here's a good example, and I milked this for years in grant applications. This thing that happened to us, we built some by we I mean a crack architecture graduate student did this for my lab. He built some beautiful models of residential interiors, and there was one interior. It was a modern design, and there was a kitchen, and of course, and in the kitchen there were these cupboards, and we could watch people duck underneath the cupboards to look at things like the sink. And so, this automatic motor reaction to what you would do if things were real. And to me, that's a hint as to what kinds of things VR might be most useful for. When the visual environment triggers certain kinds of reflexive actions in us, then those actions are likely to also take place to be the same in the real world and in VR. So the stuff that I was telling you about that I did with Robin Mazumder, one of the reasons I think that probably worked pretty well is because one of the reflexive reactions to tall buildings is to look up, and that happens just as well in VR as it does in the real world. So where you can duplicate those kinds of motor reactions to things, I think you're most likely to have success. But maybe not just there. I mean, we've tried other things. We've been off and on, and probably a little bit more on these days. We've been interested in awe experiences, and we found that they're really not easy to generate in virtual reality, except for the awe that might come from somebody who's never experienced immersive VR before, and then it's like, oh, this is really great. But these days that's more rare. So people who have some idea of how VR works, you can put them into a virtual. We built a fantastic virtual library, like a really impressive old style real library, and I know that the physical design would have been off the charts for awe responses, and we didn't get much in VR. So I think maybe some of that atmospheric stuff. We've tried other experiments too, being interested in architectural atmosphere, and they haven't gone as well as we might have liked. So that's some of the most important stuff. So understanding why that doesn't work as well is pretty important. And it might be the technology. I mean, it's still not all that fantastic an experience to wear one of those helmets for more than 15 minutes or so. It might just be that. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, I mean that. Sorry, go ahead, Sammy.
No, go Rachel.
I was just gonna say, I think it's that technology obviously is also getting better. We have spatial computing and all this stuff now, but for people who may be unaware of how that information could be beneficial to your research and then the application of how to build better built environments, you touch on this in your article about the universal attraction of vitality. I was wondering if you could just give us some information on how you're using this data of facial recognition and neuroimaging to make decisions or help give people information to make decisions in how we design our built environments.
Yeah. Okay. Well, starting with the caveat that I don't do any brain imaging myself. I mean, not others do, and there are some. It's a fantastic approach, but there are some severe limitations in terms of using brain imaging to study these kinds of problems. Just with the simple pragmatic problem that you have to be lying on your back in a tube, so that kind of limits the kinds of experiences that people can have. But there is some really nice. I'm trying to think of good examples. There's a fellow in the UK at UCL, Hugo Spears, who's just brilliant. He's just, I don't know how he does everything that he does, but he does really high quality research on wayfinding. That's a big undersell, but he uses just a big bunch of different approaches, including VR, imaging of structures like the hippocampus while people are navigating interesting kinds of spaces. So there's that kind of thing. What was the other methodology you mentioned? There's imaging and Facial expression
Like-
recognition, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I can't comment very intelligently on that. We tried to use it in my lab, and we found that we set up an experiment where we had people looking at images of built settings while we monitored their faces, and we got basically nothing except from time to time a little bit of anger. And I think the anger was probably about what we were doing with people rather than what they were looking at. I think, a long, boring procedure.
Sure.
But I think in if you could find ways to do facial expression recognition in real world settings, then there's the possibility for a lot better insight. I know that I'm not really answering your question. I'm kind of circumlocuting, but hopefully I'll get to something useful. But I'll tell you, one of the experiments that I always wanted to do, and I haven't found a way to do it yet, is to use this sounds terrible, I guess, but I'd love to use surveillance cameras on the street. I mean, my dream experiment is to have a city block, ideally a bunch of city blocks, where I can measure the facial expressions of the same people as they begin to walk a block and then at the end, or past a particular building, so that then I can measure the emotional impact on the street in real life of the experience of a particular building.
Yeah.
I think if you could do that kind of thing, there are some possibilities for measurement. I think the question had more to do with how all of this stuff can contribute to better design.
Yeah. Like, how does it translate into the action of building our environments out and creating sustainable cities and towns?
Well, I think it's going to sound boring for me to say this again, but I feel as though we're still pretty close to the beginnings of a long adventure. And we're at the stage now where we're at least understanding that we have methods that we can use, and we're understanding the importance of taking into account people's psychological state when we build. I don't think that's particularly new. I think what's new is that we now have good tools for doing that in a more systematic and principled way. The question often comes down to, are there examples, are there success stories where these kinds of approaches have contributed to better design? And unfortunately, I think the answer I give is that there aren't many. There's great potential, but it's, again, like, this sounds terrible to just keep saying this, but I think it's true that we're still finding our way.
Sure.
I have less to do with them now than I used to, but there's an organization called the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, which is based in the US, but it's become sort of worldwide. And one of the arguments that I, among others, always made there was that what we need to have is exactly what you're talking about, the success stories, the examples of where we've implemented principles that have emerged from our studies in designs and shown that they have positive impact. So I feel like, I'm going to run out of time. Like, I'm not going to live another 100 years, unfortunately, but we're just at the brink of something really fantastic, but it's going to take some time to get there. It's been a long, hard process of raising consciousness. I always have this kind of, I know I'm jumping around a little bit because the coffee's kicking in, but I always have this kind of beatific view of what happens in architecture schools. And I have a good friend, an architecture critic named Sarah Goldhagen. You should have her, by the way, on your podcast. She's brilliant and has written a wonderful book called Welcome to Your World. She's kind of like my counterpart. She's an architect who is interested in cognitive science and neuroscience, and I'm the other half. Anyway, my point was that she occasionally reminds me that, Colin, that 99% of architecture schools, this stuff is not on their radar yet. So I'm immersed in the people who are believers, and so I have this kind of weirdly distorted view of how much impact this stuff is having. So there's a long way to go. but there are encouraging signs. I mean, in my own work, one thing that's happening is that I'm just embarking on a probably fairly short term, but a partnership with Thomas Heatherwick, who's, I don't know if you know about his book Humanized that just came out fairly recently, and attached to it is this ambitious plan for a long-term campaign to encourage people to think about the kinds of issues that we're talking about here. And so he's interested in having my lab do some experiments that can form part of that campaign, and hopefully, in theory, might lead to greater penetration of some of these ideas into practice. I don't know. I'm always hopeful.
Yeah. Well, same here. I think that's why we're probably all interested in this topic. We have, to some extent, some hope that things will change. And
yeah, some of it just seems so obvious, but once you engage with the complexities of doing something in the real world, it's very hard to make change. Dreadfully hard sometimes. I'm getting a bit depressed. Ask me another question.
Okay. Well, I think I have one that might cheer us up a little bit, but your research highlights the importance of vitality in urban design. And you were just talking about some of the principles that is part of this campaign for, let's say, cities that are centered around well-being and around care. Could you explain some of the, principles or kind of the techniques or methods that should be employed, in urban settings to make sure that we're promoting positive experiences or promoting well-being and more livable and healthier cities?
Yeah, sure. Most of my work in this area, including the work where I've used that term vitality, it started with an interest in trying to understand some of the mechanisms involved in people's responses to explicit nature. So there's a long, strong tradition in environmental psychology of looking at using nature explicitly to change people's mental state, to encourage well-being, even to enhance public health. And so, in fact, when I began to use VR, one of the first studies that we did was to build a virtual rainforest, and to stress people out, which psychologists were really good at. I think we're better at making people feel horrible than we are at making people feel good. We know how to press all the buttons. So we get people into a horrible state in the lab by getting them to recount dreadful experiences in their lives while listening to industrial noise on headphones and also doing mental.
Sounds like a dream.
Oh man, they were just like 10 minutes with us and they were a complete mess. And then we put them in this virtual rainforest to see if we could restore them. And it worked really well. So that was the beginnings of my interest in vitality, with the questions about what is it about what's in there that does that. And especially, are there ways to include that in cities? And, obviously good landscape architecture is one way to do it. And that's really important, and that's been demonstrated scientifically, the power of even stuff like boulevard trees to change people's mental state, or putting some landscaping into vacant lots had measurable impact on mental health. But the other kinds of interesting questions are there ways to incorporate any of that stuff in the design of things that aren't explicitly trees and plants? And so we have spent a long time looking at things like, we focused especially on building facades, and we've been looking at the facade complexity and measuring complexity in various ways, and then measuring the psychological impact of that on people. So I mean, that's one fairly simple example of how you can get the right degree of complexity in say a streetscape that mirrors, at least at the mathematical level, the kind of complexity that you'd see in nature. And
That's interesting. It's funny you mentioned that actually, because are you familiar with the new traditionalist movement that's happening in architecture?
Mhm.
So I'm curious because of the, just reading some of your work, like why you feel this is starting to come up now, especially given that in my opinion, I feel that postmodernism and modernism evoke very similar feelings in our built environment. And this resurgence of wanting more traditional style architecture has been very fun to observe and start to take part in. So I'd love to see or hear what your experience, somebody who's done so much research on this stuff, what your thoughts are on it, and how you see it contributing to us being able to connect to our spaces better and to each other, of course.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting area. I think that there's some, and I'm going to be careful with my words here because I think that this is important, but also subtle. I think that there are some things about those traditionalist designs that are likely to be in sync, let's say, with the kinds of things that I'm talking about. The the experience of vitality in an urban setting. I think that maybe the mistake of the really serious advocates of these kinds of designs is to suppose that that's the only way to go.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think one of the things that's long interested me is thinking about the traditional methods for building. If you think even of stuff like building with stone, you
Hmm.
when you build with those kinds of materials, you have to honor the physics, right, or your buildings fall down. And honoring
Right.
the physics is almost obligatory that you're going to design in such a way that's going to mirror some of the patterns that are found in nature. After all, you're using a kind of material that's very, very natural.
Yeah. That's
Um,
interesting.
so I think there's a risk of mistaking all of that for feeling like traditionalism is it's the only way to go, that we've got to get back to the way things used to be. And I think again it's this stuff gets mixed up with some politics as well. I've seen that
Yeah. Very much so.
happen. And I agree with you. I think there's some lovely architecture that doesn't conform to those kinds of design principles at all, and yet works really well and is vital. Yeah, maybe I'll just
Yeah.
leave it there.
No, I agree. I'll just add that I think it is finding that balance between, I think, the old and the new. I'm personally a big fan of looking at older structures and finding ways to repair them so that they can be revitalized and used again, but
Yeah,
respecting some of the older heritage, yet still incorporating more modern technologies to bring the building up to current standards. So finding that balance is very difficult, and there's a couple of firms that I'm familiar with that are doing that kind of work, that
yeah,
always interests me. But yeah, balance is always difficult to find. That's for sure.
yeah, yeah. It really is, and things can get heated in a hurry, can't they? Over
Oh yeah.
these kinds of issues. Yeah. Hmm.
Rachel, for the listeners, would you mind explaining the new traditionalist architecture movement?
Sure.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, it's a movement of people who are taking a step away from postmodernist and modernist styles of designing and building. If that is kind of a reflection of styles like Mies van der Rohe or Walter Gropius, where they were really letting the material be the talking point, the new traditionalist style is about incorporating a bit more ornamentation that is probably more so associated with Baroque styles of architecture, which if you go to an old church and this is your first time and your first experience talking about architecture, if you go to old churches in Europe, these are more ornamented styles of architecture, whereas the more buildings in like New York City, more modern buildings in New York City are probably more so associated with modernist architecture. And the new traditionalists are essentially advocating for spaces that have more of these details in them, because it adds a bit of a different nuance to your experience in space versus cold buildings that are only made of glass and strict stone. Now, again, I think that finding the balance between the two is probably what we need to do, and maybe in every place is going to look different as well. But it's something that I've been following and starting to get into, and I encourage others to get into as well. And if they're interested in having that kind of conversation, they can also reach out to me on my channels.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, within your research on the psychology of residential design, what are some common elements of well-designed living spaces that contribute to positive mental and physical health outcomes?
Yeah, I think there are a few things. Most of them probably don't come from my research. I've only done a little bit of work on residential design, and I think one of the this is not an answer to your question, but I'll just say that one of the things the thing that I found most surprising about the research that I've done on people's responses to residential designs. This was a VR study. Well, maybe I should give you a little bit of detail of the study. We designed some different styles of residence in VR, and then we recruited people who were in the housing market looking for places to live, to walk through these places, and we measured their bodies as we do, and we asked them lots of questions, and we tracked where they went. And then at the end of the whole thing, we asked them, if you could buy any one of these three houses, which one would you buy? And the houses were, we had a Frank Lloyd Wright design, a Sarah Suzanka design, who Sarah Suzanka is an American architect who I think she became well known because of a book that she wrote called The Not So Big House, with the design philosophy that it wasn't the square foot formula that determined how successful a house was. It was how well it was put together and functional. So that was one of the houses. And then the third one was this kind of typical, we called it a McMansion design, but it wasn't really a McMansion, but it was a typical suburban townhouse in Milton. It was an actual structure. And our measurements told us that there was a clear winner, which was the Suzanka design, that had the right kinds of biometrics, that people generally gave the right kinds of answers to questions about the way that they would use the space, and their patterns of movement through the space were most encouraging. But when we put the question to them, most people said, I choose the Milton townhouse. And what it taught me was the power of social norms, and especially in the qualitative data, they just said things like, well, this is the kind of house that my friends would expect me to buy, that I would, if I had say the Frank Lloyd Wright house. They didn't know it was Frank, well, they probably figured it out, but they said if I had this house, my friends would just think I was weird, like, why did you buy this crazy designer house?
Right.
So social norms are really powerful. And that's a little bit of a tangent to the question you asked, which is, what are the good principles to use in residential design? I think some of the things that I've learned from my work that have real power in successful residential design have to do even with basic things like the shapes of spaces. So there's a duality that we've talked about in environmental psychology since at least the 1970s. This started to be bandied about, the duality of prospect and refuge. So what we like to have in spaces, and this is true at any scale, including inside our homes, is that we like to have positions where we can feel some protection. Which seems a little bit odd to think of. This is inside your home, but still, even there, we want that feeling of being kind of enshrouded. Maybe is not the best word, but now I've used it. Enshrouded by the protective arms of something but at the same time, we have some views about what's going on in the space. If you've got a space where you can't get those kinds of dualities working really well, then that's going to be an uncomfortable space. Things like legibility of the space, how and coherence, how well things kind of fit together. Some of which you can do with just the arrangement of things, lighting, floor covering. All of those things can have an impact as well on how a space is partitioned mentally. Views of nature is kind of an obvious one. I mean, that's depending on your circumstances, that can be hard to get. But even if it's a modest representation of nature, that you can manage to find a way to have those kinds of views outside your windows. And I know even that's kind of challenging, especially in high density, but that's going to make for a more successful residence. People talk about color a lot as if we understand it, but we don't. We know almost nothing about how color works, in spite of what the glossy design magazines will tell you. We know a bit more about pattern, and the same kinds of things that I mentioned in the context of building facades, I think are also true about the use of patterns, curvature in in residential settings. There's a basic set of principles that I think we do have some notion of how they work in those kinds of interiors. And there's, as I'm repeating in boring fashion, there's still a ton that we don't know about.
For sure.
How this works.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I guess just a follow up to kind of get a overall encompassing understanding of all of this is, what would you say is the significance between space and place in the person, that overall community environment and the impact it has on people? So the significance of the impact, I guess.
Oh, you ask tough questions. That's kind of like
I'm sorry.
Well, I think that I'll just retreat first of all back to my basic mission statement, which is that I just think that until recently, and well, it's still probably true, most people just do not appreciate how important place is to our everyday life and our everyday behavior. One of the most gratifying parts of the experiments that I've done in the field studies is that I'll always remember this one case. I had this walk that I designed in the Lower East Side of New York, and I took people to a wild variety of places, including a busy streetscape, an affordable housing complex, and this magnificent community garden it was called the Mafinda Kalunga Garden, which was smack in the middle of the Lower East Side. Totally unexpected. I mean, talk about serendipity. And so I had people come on walks with me. A lot of them were tourists. Some of them were from away, but within New York State. And some of them were locals. And there was this dear lady who was one of the locals, and she said, I walk through the Lower East Side basically every day to do my shopping. And I didn't know this was here, but I also didn't really think about how profoundly being here has affected how I feel and my outlook for the rest of the day. And I'm going to do this every day from now on. I'm going to go through this garden. Mm-hmm. So I think, I'm starting to forget where your question was now, but I think the mission is to heighten our understanding of those connections. That is, I don't think there's, I'm a little biased because it's what I do, but I don't think there's anything more important than setting as a single kind of very multifactorial variable, I guess you could call it, that has an influence on who we are.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Was that an answer to your question at all?
Yeah, no, I think that last piece answered that question, and I come from the same position, and so does Alex, and so does Rachel. Like before I did my master's in planning, I did it in geography, focused a lot on human geography, but also just overall environments and stuff, and so also just like a very diverse lived experience. And so, yeah, I think that space has such a huge role in people, and I think when people don't recognize it, they don't realize what's impacting them on that day to day. So I'm just kind of curious to see your position on it. And I don't know, it's kind of hard to how do you say, like, quantify that, like go like 8 out of 10 significance, you know, or like 10 out of 10 significance. But yeah.
You're right. Yeah, and I think going back to the points about technology, I think we've really been seduced by the ease with which we can do certain kinds of things now, into the belief that we can just jettison all this stuff. And I think it's just awful. It's going to lead us to places we don't want to go. Maybe already is. Maybe already has.
Yeah, for sure. We are getting close to the end of our, I guess, requested time. So do you have any questions for us, Colin?
No, I don't think so. It's been a delight to talk to all of you. So now you're going to edit this down to something comprehensible and then put it up somewhere.
Yeah, somewhere within the black hole of social media.
The black hole of the internet.
The black hole of the internet.
Speaking of technology, okay. So yeah, if you could just send me a link, then I'll do what I can with my meager channels to promote it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
That's awesome.
So
I'd like to add one last note to hopefully not leave it on so much of a sad technology is killing us. But to the other side of it, I think that leveraging it as a tool to help us connect with people and learn faster about the nuances of what potential cities and towns are suffering and struggling with. We have that ability now, I think, more than ever, and there's more data points that we can capture now more than ever. So the next task, in my opinion, is learning how to cipher through that data so that we can use our knowledge base to connect with other people who have this similar knowledge base, but maybe come from a different perspective, and also help the people that ultimately we're trying to help. These communities get closer together and increase social bonds and social capital. So I like to think that it's not all bad, and it's just we're at a point where it feels uneasy and there's a bit of an unknown. And yeah. That's a
lovely way of summarizing it. We're poised for something great. We've got, you're right, we've got all of the raw materials in place. Slowly but surely, I think we're raising awareness of this stuff. And again, everybody's a little bit tired, I think, of talking about the pandemic. But I think one of my great hopes, which I still have to some extent, is that one of the outcomes of what we went through, where so many of us were trapped in places like the little room that I'm sitting in right now, that I still spend too much of my life in, was that we would have new recognition of the importance of being able to go places and experience things, and we'd have opportunities to think more about how all of that works and what impact it has. And I think that some of that has happened. I mean, in the endless webinars that everybody was doing because we didn't know what else to do with ourselves during the lockdown, the thing that I heard the most from people, and I said this myself, is that the last thing we want is to go back to business as usual. We want to use this as a catapult to something better.
Completely.
We're in a position where, you put it beautifully, where that could happen. We just all need to put our shoulders to the wheel and not let up.
Totally.
Not be complacent.
Keep on applying pressure.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your insights, and thank you, Rachel, for joining us in this conversation. Before we head out, Colin, are there any, where can the viewers find your research or get involved with all the cool things that you do?
Well, I have a website which is just colinellard.com, which works reasonably well most of the time. Although the pictures there are nothing like me anymore, so you wouldn't be able to find me from it. Our laboratory at the University of Waterloo is called the Urban Realities Laboratory, which, to be honest, we only picked because then the acronym will be URL, which we thought was kind of cool.
Ah, yeah.
I have a Twitter account that I don't use very much anymore. It's where am I now? Yeah, and you can find emails from the website or from looking me up at the university, and I'm always happy to hear from people by email.
Awesome. Thank you so much, and we'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Great. You're welcome. My pleasure.
We really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.